My name is Sergey Radchenko. I am the Wilson Ishman Distinguished Professor at the School of Advanced International Studies, Johns Hopkins University. And I'm based in Bologna in Italy, where SAIS has a presence. It's about the Cold War, to be very brief. It focuses mainly on Soviet and Chinese foreign policies during the Cold War, approximately from the late 1945 until the end of the Cold War, as generally understood, approximately in 1991. Although there is also an epilogue that takes us to the present, and then actually this is one of the points of the book. I try to make a connection between the Cold War and where we are here today. In this world that is also characterized by increasing tension and confrontation. Well, I would say what motivates me personally is the fact that the world that we live in today, in some respects, seems to be a little bit similar to the world of the Cold War. It seems that the communist ideology has fallen by the wayside. It's no longer really there. Well, we might argue it is still there for the Chinese, for example, but the world has changed in so many ways, and yet something is still here that is reminiscent of the Cold War. The nuclear confrontation, the proxy wars, all of those things that we thought were part of the past are coming back to bite us. And I was interested in reassessing the past and trying to see what lessons we could learn, we could draw from that period of the Cold War, of that confrontation, that might be also applicable to the present. So that is kind of a general motivation. Another motivation for rewriting or writing another book about the Cold War is that suddenly, approximately, I would say starting from about 10 years ago or so, materials in Russia have were suddenly declassified that shed new light on the history of the Cold War. And that was counterintuitive because Russia was sliding more and more towards authoritarianism. And yet suddenly materials became available, documents in the archives that allowed us to revisit almost every, I should say not almost, but every Cold War crisis with new evidence and the new documentation. So I went to Moscow and spent many months working through this new materials, which have turned from a trickle to an absolute deluge of stuff. There's just a huge amount of materials. And then I also had remarkable access in China for a time. When before, sort of as the Hu Jintao administration wound up, and the Xi Jinping administration rolled in, this was the time that I was also living in China, working in the Chinese archives, and I was able to obtain a considerable amount of documentation on the Chinese Cold War before the Xi Jinping administration cracked down and things became closed once again for historians. So I had a unique opportunity to work with the materials of the key players in the Cold War, Soviet Union, China, and on that basis, draw an write an entirely new account of what happened. A lot of the themes are familiar to historians of the Cold War, but anybody reading this book will find new evidence and new fantastic stories about different aspects of the Cold War that we knew nothing about. There are two aspects of the book which will appeal to readers. First is the general argument of the book, which is, I think, novel and very unusual. And the argument is that the key players during the Cold War, particularly the Soviets, of course, I focus on the Soviets there. They are the main subject of the book. The key players wanted nothing as much as legitimacy on the international stage. And that legitimacy came by the way of recognition of their greatness. Consider the Soviet Union, consider the Kremlin. Soviet leaders had this concern about their standing. They wanted to be recognized for their greatness. And the key recognizers were the Americans. So Soviet foreign policy throughout the Cold War was driven by desire for American recognition of Soviet greatness, because the Americans were the other great power that they want to be recognized by, right? They didn't want to be recognized just by anyone. They wanted to have this recognition from the United States. That's why the book is called To Run the World. Where does to Run the World come from? It actually comes from a proposal that Soviet leader Leonid Brezhnev made to Kissinger when they were in the privacy of a hunting tower in not far from Moscow in 1973. Brezhnev basically turned to Kissinger saying, you know what, I'll tell you without notes, without anything, I'll tell you, here's what we want to do. We want to run the world together with the United States. This idea absolutely drove Soviet decision-making. They obsessed over this. They wanted to be next to the United States running the world, and became very jealous if there were other pretenders to this great power status. So this is one part of the argument. The other part, of course, being that they also wanted recognition from China. And indeed, this is one of the major arguments of the book, and that's why China is such a big part of the book. The Soviets, throughout the Cold War, always looked over their shoulder to try to see what the Chinese were thinking about them. They wanted to be recognized by China as the great, as a great revolutionary power, the leader of the world communist movement, etc., because that too gave them legitimacy. So the Soviets craved for recognition, for American recognition on the one hand, and also for China's recognition, also the recognition of the so-called revolutionary world. But of course, China was the most important one. China was the most important. But these two facets of recognition were in constant contradiction, were in conflict with one another. And so that is what made the Cold War such an interesting period to study for me. So this is the main thesis, main argument of the book. And can you believe this? I actually talked about the Cold War, about my main argument, without actually mentioning the word ideology. And so readers of the book will be so surprised as they read through the book. They'll see, well, wait a second, where's communist ideology? And of course it mattered. Of course it mattered. But I show in the book that it wasn't just that, that really the Soviets wanted recognition of their greatness, and they were striving for leadership. They wanted to run the world. And this theme is what connects the Cold War to the post-Cold War, because although communism fell by the wayside and it was no longer important after 1991, certainly in Russia's policymaking, the idea of Russian greatness, of standing up there and running the world, being recognized as one of the great powers in the world, that remained, and that continues to drive in some ways Russian policymaking today. So these are the arguments of the book that I just outlined. And of course, the other major reason for readers to go to this book is that I just have fantastic new evidence on every crisis in the Cold War, stuff we did not know about, stuff we knew about but did not know enough about. And the book retells all those crises, from the Cuban Missile Crisis to Berlin Crisis to Yom Kippur War, the Sino-Soviet split, the Korean War, just everything. It's there. That's why the book is so long, but I'm sure that readers will enjoy it. We thought when the Cold War ended that history ended with the Cold War, that everything would be fine. Liberal democracy triumphed. Russia embraced the West. Here, everything was going in the right direction until it no longer was. So now we are 30 years, more than 30 years after the end of the Cold War. We're sliding back towards something that is so remarkably similar to the Cold War. Now, of course, there are differences. Of course, there are differences in the ideologies that I talked about, or in the ideological confrontation is perhaps no longer here, and certainly no longer here in the same sort of way. Communism is of the kind that the Soviet Union was trying to advance is no longer being advanced. And on the other hand, elements of the Cold War remain. So we are still today in a situation where Russia confronts the West. Russia has more nuclear weapons today than at during some of the early Cold War crises, to be frank. Russia has an enormous destructive capacity. It can destroy the world. And this is, by the way, this also was a very salient aspect of the Cold War, right? Once the Russians understood that they had nuclear weapons back in the 1950s, that changed their approach to international politics, and they felt that they could do more because people would have to recognize that they were dealing with a superpower. So today, Russia is again hiding behind nuclear weapons in order to advance its foreign policy goals in Europe and in the world. Is also engaged in various proxy wars, whether in the Middle East by supporting regimes like Syria's, or indeed in Africa through Wagner, or of course in Ukraine. So though there are some remarkable similarities to the Cold War, but I think fundamentally what is interesting is that Russia is still craving for some kind of recognition, although I think now Vladimir Putin has given up the idea of running the world together with the United States, as at different points Brezhnev would have, or Khrushchev or even Gorbachev might have entertained. Now he wants to be recognized as America's greatest adversary, because by being recognized as such, he gains legitimacy for himself and for his rule. This kind of recognition as America's great adversary is what really is something that Putin really wants. And so this craving for recognition, whether as a partner or as an adversary, and this idea that perhaps you could rise above your circumstances and run the world, or have at least another opportunity to do so. Of course, Russia today is no longer the kind of superpower that it was during the Soviet Union, but still it's trying. It's trying. I think this is an interesting point of continuity between the Cold War and the post-Cold War that we fail to recognize. Histories of the Cold War were written in the immediate euphoria of 1989, of the post-Cold War moment, and we thought that this was a closed chapter. And it turns out that the book did not end. There are other chapters, and the storyline continues, and that continuity is what informs my work. So I think a lot of people coming to this book today will look around the world today and they will think, okay, what is driving those actors, people like Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping? And I think by reading the book and by learning those lessons of history, they'll be able to better appreciate where we stand in today's world. So the book has fantastic anecdotes about, as I mentioned, almost every aspect of the Cold War. Here's what I was surprised by. I was interested in understanding why Nikita Khrushchev backed off when faced with a possibility of a nuclear war. Now, that happened on a number of occasions, but most prominently in 1961 and 62 during the Berlin, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Now, in the Berlin crisis, the Soviets were discussing the problem. They wanted to squeeze the Americans out of West Berlin, and they thought that they would be able to do this because the Americans would never risk a nuclear war with the United States, with the Soviet Union, for Berlin. Why would anybody want to do that, right? Why would anybody want to exchange Boston for Berlin, figuratively speaking? And so Khrushchev estimated the chances of war at being at 5%. We will push the Americans, we'll squeeze the Americans out of West Berlin. There's a 5% chance that this will end in nuclear war. So the odds were pretty good. If you're a gambler, think about it. If you're a gambler and the chances of winning are 95%, you will take the risk. It's a pretty good risk. However, Khrushchev was risking or gambling with the fate of human civilization, because nuclear war will be so dangerous. And as he pondered this question of whether to run this risk or not, he remembered a moment from the early stage of the German invasion of the USSR, which began in June 1941. There was a guy who commanded one of the armies on the sort of from the front with Germany, whose name was Nikolai Vashugin, and he lost the tank army. He came back to Khrushchev saying, "Oh, I don't know what to do. I lost an army." And Khrushchev said, "Well, what can I tell you?" And so this guy, Nikolai Vashugin, a Soviet commander, pulled out a handgun and blew his brains out right in front of Khrushchev. And that's obviously a very dramatic thing. Imagine experiencing something like this. But what's interesting is that Khrushchev brought this up in the context of talking about the Berlin crisis in 1961. He had experience of the Second World War. He saw how horrible this was, and he also understood that human beings were not always rational. They took decisions that sometimes just defied rationality. And he worried that if he pushed his luck in Berlin, that this 5% could turn into 50% or 95%. Who knew? He could just simply never really trust in the rationality of the other side or indeed his own. So in the end, he decided to back off. And instead of pushing the world to the brink of war in Berlin, they built the Berlin Wall, which of course became the ugly symbol of the Cold War. But in many ways, it stabilized the Cold War as well, because after that, Germany was simply divided, and there was a kind of stability that characterized the Cold War after that. But it is interesting to look into personal motivations of leaders like this. And I was very fortunate to have access to Khrushchev's personal papers so that I could really reconstruct his thinking on this key questions of war and peace. I think the main takeaway was that the Cold War was a very nasty, very brutal confrontation, and we were lucky to survive it. It's very sad. Unfortunately, this is what you come away with. We were lucky that we pulled through in the various crises that could have brought the world into could have ended with a nuclear war. Well, I hope the readers will enjoy the 860 pages filled with thrilling stories of diplomacy, espionage, betrayal, mystery, geopolitics. It's all there. The whole world is there. Every country, well, not every country is mentioned, but there's every there's something for almost everyone. There's Russia, there's China, there's the United States, there's the Middle East, there's Africa, there's Cuba, Southeast Asia. All these things, all these plots intertwined together make for a gripping reading, as I hope I will be. I hope this is the impression that my readers also get. So please do write to me afterwards and critique or express your concerns, because I would love to hear back from readers. Of course, I've spent 10 years writing this book. It's a major book, a major effort. But I certainly I look forward to engagement with readers.